In the last lesson, we looked at using the if statement to make simple decisions. And in the example, we were looking at how to calculate gross pay. And in the example, we had two if statements, one to control if hours worked is less than or equal to 40, and another one if hours worked was greater than 40. Most likely in a real program, we wouldn't write it this way. What we do instead is we'd say if hours worked is less than or equal to 40, then gross pay is equal to salary times hours worked, else gross pay is equal to, and then the formula that we used. So let's look at how to write that again using if-else, but first let's look at the syntax for the if-else. And I'm also going to introduce you to a different style for writing if statements. So we start off with if relational expression, just like we did before. And now this time I'm going to put the opening brace for my block on the same line as the if. And then we indent, just like before, and then we write the statement, block, which should be one or more statements. We only had one in this example, but oftentimes we'll have more than one. Then we'll close off the statement block. Then we have the else part. The else part is only to be executed if the relational expression here is false. And again, we indent and then put our statement block inside the else and then close it off with a closing curly brace. The difference between the if-else and the two ifs is that in the two ifs, this if is always evaluated even if this if is true. We only want to evaluate hours worked greater than 40 if it is indeed greater than 40. If hours worked is 40 or less, then all we want to do is execute this statement and then stop calculating gross pay. This part is not even needed. And that's what we get with the else. If the relational expression is true, execute this statement block, else or otherwise execute this statement block. Let's rewrite our if statement using the else instead. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put this opening brace on the same line as the if. Save a little space. We can completely get rid of this. We'll add the else, bring this opening brace here, and now we have the full if-else. Let's execute that, see how it works, make sure that it does work correctly. So we'll type $20 for the salary, 40 hours worked, and that's 800. That's easy to do. Let's run it again. 20, this time 45 hours, and that's 950, so that's right. One thing I want to mention before we leave this lesson is notice the style I use of indenting the statements in the statement block inside the if and the else. That's very important because it makes your program easier to read, and that really should be one of your primary goals of programming. Not only that your program should be executed and that the compiler can execute it correctly and that you get the right outputs given the right inputs, but people are also going to be reading your programs, and so you need to make them as easy as possible to read. And by indenting 2 or 3 spaces or even a full tab, although sometimes tabs can be a problem when you have to indent a lot. But by indenting, you make the program easier to read, because if I'm scanning the code and I'm looking for the part that goes inside the if, it's right here. It's easy to find. If everything is left justified in your program like this, and this is certainly legal, it will compile and run, but it's harder to read. Just like we break up sentences into paragraphs, partly for meaning purposes, but also because it's easier to read it and it makes more sense. We do the same thing with indenting code. So even though I tell you that it's not necessary for the compiler that you indent code, but you should still indent it, you need to keep that in mind because these are accepted styles that all programmers follow now. You would never see an experienced programmer write his code all flush left. So this is an example of the if-else. And what I'd like to do in the next lesson is look at some more examples of if-elses where we actually have nested ifs inside ifs. So we'll see that in the next lesson.